that's okay because we're talking about theatre, so you don't need anything. So my name's May, and I'm the co-founder of a studio called Anagram in the UK, and we create immersive narrative experiences. So although this is about VR, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of how we came to be doing this, because I think it kind of informs our attitude. But at the heart of the question that we have in Anagram is, how can physical experience be part of a narrative? And for that we usually need to use technology for some reason, but it's not kind of at the heart. It's always kind of serving what places your body can take you that aren't the places that your mind can take you. And so in the context of today's theme about archives, I thought it would be interesting to think about the pleasure of forgetting and not so much the necessity of remembering, and how forgetfulness is something that is also an opportunity to reinvent ourselves. So I'll tell you about the collider, which I think you heard a bit about. I'm not sure what you heard. I hope it was good. But before I do that, just so I know a bit about you, I've never been to Poland. Can you put your hand up if you're a maker, like if you make things, like anything, pots, theatre? Oh, loads of you, great. And if you're a curator? Less. If you're an academic? Yes, okay, good, that's really helpful. So I'll tell you a bit about process, and I'll put some quotes in there for the academics. But this is from a novel, it's not from a very serious academic, but somewhere else I think might be nice to start is this extract from a novel, from which I slightly stole the title, which is about our the stories we tell of ourselves. How often do we tell our own life story? How often do we adjust, embellish, make sly cuts? And the longer life goes on, the fewer are those around to challenge our account, to remind us that our life is not our life, merely the story we have told of our life, told to others, but mainly to ourselves. But a bit more about what we do. So my background, I was making documentary films for 10 years before I founded Anagram with a good friend called Amy. And particularly the world of documentary that I came from was news and current affairs. And I was very interested in doing that because I had the naive belief as a young graduate that I could somehow change the world and make things different. And in that time in London, there was also, I'm not sure how many people heard of the work of people like Punch Drunk. There's a very thriving immersive theatre scene. So immersive theatre is not like normal theatre. You tend to be thrown into fantastical worlds where you're invited to participate with actors or sets or scenery, and there's an element of the deeply fantastical and playful and silly, and very much the possibility and the hunger of people who would be part of that, of which me and my friends were also in our silly days of youth, was that you could explore a place where you could be someone in the nighttime that you weren't really. The opportunity to cross a threshold and play the game of being someone who wasn't yourself. But they were very silly. So there was a question which was, could you use the tricks and playfulness of immersive theatre and bring it into the dark, intense world of current affairs and still come up with something meaningful? Could you think of interaction in a human, playful way? And in order to do that, a lot of the stuff, so this is what are we looking at here? A lot of the this is backstage Anagram. A lot of the things that we end up having to try, because we're interested in physical experience before we were interested in VR or interested in anything else, is how does it feel when you do something? How does it feel when you stick headphones up your nose, when you're blindfolded and you try to draw a picture, when you're held upside down, when you walk past a security camera showing an image of you 15 minutes ago, what are the sensations that they bring up by things that take place, not ideas? So, am I breathing quite a lot into this microphone? I feel a little bit suspicious. Was this another sound? Okay, yeah, it's me. Maybe I'm nervous. So I'll come to that in a sec. So I'm going to tell you a bit about our first project. When we were approaching this particular question very naively, which is how could you do documentary in an immersive way? And our first project was called Door into the Dark. And in Door into the Dark, it was an experience about being lost. And we chose the idea of being lost because we thought you can't fake being lost. If you're lost, you're lost. If you feel it, you feel it. If you don't feel it, then you're not lost. So we're going to have to kind of meet the stakes. So in Door into the Dark, you're blindfolded. You're alone. You arrive to... let's start at the beginning. You book a slot. You arrive at a door, the address of which you've been texted 30 minutes previously. When you get there, somebody knows your name and ushers you into a waiting room. In the waiting room, you're told that you have to wait for the last person before you to finish. You take off your shoes, put your things in the locker. When the person before you has finished, they tell you what you need to do, and they put a headset, it's not a VR headset, it's a blindfold effectively with headphones, and takes you by the hand and puts you onto a rope. You can't see anything, it's dark, you walk through the door into the darkness, and you listen to the voices of people who've been lost, guided by a narrator who explains what you need to do. So I'll just play you a bit of the trailer.
This is a labyrinth. For now, all you need to do is follow the rope.
When you're blind, there's no sun, except there's warmth. There's no blue sky, there's no clouds. There are no walls. There are no limits to your world. You are a body standing on something in space.
Can you feel the hairs on your cheeks? Are they wide awake? Where are you?
So, you're in a state of mind where if one of us falls, we're going to die. You find yourself trying to cut off from those thoughts. But at the same time, if you allow yourself to know what the situation is, it exerts a kind of pull. What would it be like, to take a fall? I sense that urge. The urge to surrender to the void.
So for 45 minutes in Door into the Dark, you're exploring a sensory set guided by this audio narration. You when you get to the end of the rope, you discover new things in different chapters. And the entire thing is about not only people who've been lost, but your own relationship with being lost. Is it a joyous, terrifying, or exhilarating experience? And kind of looking back through our documents when we were making this, I come across one of the very early story plans that we made, which in a way was quite naive because effectively we charted our ideal narrative experience, not from the kind of perspective of what happened in the narration or what happened to the set, but what would happen like inside the person as they move through the journey, which is very ambitious, but kind of it's an interesting thing in terms of thinking about interactivity and immersion as like designing from the perspective of the participant and not kind of from the perspective of your narrative arc. So there was this sense that there needed to be exhilaration at points, and that kind of effectively there needed to be a happy ending. What the happy ending is a little bit of a kind of, it's a plot spoiler, but you may never see Door into the Dark. Once you do return to the room, having kind of gone through this journey in the darkness, and you see the next person who has been waiting for you in order to kind of go onto the rope and do the journey. When you finally do leave that identical room, you discover that it's not the same room and you are kind of somewhere else in the building. So it's kind of a happy ending in that people end up laughing, although there are kind of moments which are very emotional. So when we kind of began to approach kind of the question of VR, I'm going to hold it further away. Can you still hear? Okay, and less breathing. Okay. So the question was like, okay, in terms of this medium, what actually is happening when somebody is in the headset? Kind of what's the real kind of crux of the experience that we can play with that isn't kind of too much seduced by what's inside, but actually kind of the act of going into VR? Like, what is it a metaphor for? So this is the Collider. I think it was mentioned that it was at Venice, where it was part of the Best of VR selection. And effectively, we're looking for a metaphor for kind of what VR could be. So the Collider is effectively kind of the story of the Collider is that it's a machine, and it's a machine not unlike the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, but instead of throwing particles at each other in order to kind of discover the Higgs boson particle or like the nature of the bonds within atoms, this machine throws people at each other, two at a time, in order to try and decipher what kind of bonds are formed between humans. Where, if it was to travel the world and experiment on hundreds and thousands of people, would there be a pattern? Could we work out which kind of atoms dominated others and which bonds were easily broken? So I'm just going to kind of show you a little bit of what happened at the very beginning of the process. Now it is kind of like a beautiful finished thing, but in the end it was like, in the beginning it was like quite an ugly thing. But effectively, it started off with me and Amy, kind of in, where were we? Vancouver with the NFB guys, playing around with the Vive headset in 2016. And he showed us the nice, cool things that happen in VR. But we kind of got quite seduced with just kind of hanging out in the kind of Unity loading screen zone and chasing each other using the controllers. And the sensation of it being interesting that fundamentally, even in VR, you could recognize a human form as soon as something got picked up. And what was that ineffable thing? And who was leading who and who had power? So a year later, we devised kind of the story that would allow us to kind of play with this mechanism, the story of the machine that was colliding individuals, and within the headset, you would see these very kind of like abstracted images of the other person who was encountering you. So this was like maybe 6 months later, kind of a testing session where we were working on the storyline. And there was this thing that kind of happened because of the anonymity afforded by a headset, which was effectively also a blindfold. This ability for people, this is me obviously, but in the real world it's not always me in the Collider, this ability for kind of people to kind of find this playfulness with another person, which is often really hard in immersive theatre because of the kind of awkwardness that immediately happens when you feel like somebody might be able to make eye contact with you. And so the story developed around the Collider being fundamentally this abstracted story about the machine, but really what we wanted to do was to allow people to think about their own relationship with power, in relationships with others, not just kind of romantic ones, but just everyday ones. What's the kind of choreography of who takes the lead and who kind of allows the other person to dominate? And so within the machine, there is a moment when the person who's the controller person, having kind of gone through a waiting room encounters the person in VR through the grate in the room and discovers that they're waiting for them. And the person in VR does not know when the other person arrives. And then they kind of go through this dance. Can I go over by 1 minute? Thanks. But we wanted to allow people to think about this difficult subject, which is power. And this was in the context of like lots of, kind of 2017, the kind of Me Too conversation is kind of very significant in the media. Trump had been elected. We wanted to kind of think kind of beyond the kind of surface news stories. What was the kind of internal situation which allowed us, or sometimes encouraged us to seek people who might tell us what to do? And what was it in ourselves that also allowed those things, or kind of sought those things out? And so, before, it's very hard talking about immersive theatre in words. It's almost as hard as playing a game. So in order to allow kind of that reflective moment to happen in this kind of playful context of this imaginary machine that was obviously too silly to really exist, each person, when they first arrive to the Collider, goes into 2 separate rooms, which is known as the waiting room. In the waiting room, they're asked to think of a memory, which links me to the theme of archive. And the person who will be the controller person, i.e. the person on the right in these pictures, thinks of a memory where they had power over somebody else. The person who is the VR person thinks of a memory when they felt that someone had power over them. And they're given 3 minutes to think of this memory and to recreate the memory in miniature inside a glass cabinet in the room. Later in the experience, when they are together, they're invited to remember this memory again and reenact it with the other person silently. So these memories that people made became really a powerful part of the experience because they gave them the time to really think about their place in the story. And also the act of making the memory inevitably meant that you had to deconstruct somebody else's memory. And you can see from these, there's no words, there's no explanation. You don't know why these 2 people are in the pool, or there seems to be some kind of wedding on the ground here. But it became this moment where people would think about the other person's moment of honesty and then create their own. And we were often asked if we created an archive of these images or of the little models that people had made. And we never did. These are pictures that kind of occasionally took on phones in between sessions when we kind of walked past. But I felt that there was something kind of really important to allow people to kind of just have this temporary reminder of this moment, which they then reenacted. The moment where they reenacted the memory, they were invited, if they wanted, to say something out loud that they wished that they might have said in the real experience. And this opportunity kind of to relive something in this space with a stranger became a really powerful part of the piece. And often we'd be backstage kind of pressing the buttons to make things happen. And you'd catch wind of these little lone sentences being spoken to strangers, and then make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. And we also took this piece to Qingdao in China, and it was translated into Mandarin. And so there were moments when somebody kind of in the headset and somebody with the controllers were actually listening to audio that was in 2 different languages and also speaking to each other. So it became this very tender place that was possible because of not only the abstraction of the narrative, but also this strange choreography of the VR. I've run out of time ages ago. But yes, thanks very much. I'm afraid it isn't here, but it will be one day.